So joining us, I think she's here with us, is Karen McDonald, Oakland County Prosecutor, talking about bullying and the criminal justice system, which is something that we are all interested in because we want to do as much prevention as we can. So Karen doesn't have all of her job to do, right? Cut some of that out. So Karen, thank you for joining us this morning and taking time out. And I guess I will give it over to you to talk about, bullying in the criminal justice system today.
Good morning. I think the first thing I want to do is just educate everyone and introduce myself and what my background is. I am currently the Oakland County Prosecutor, which I realize we have people from all over. So that is the county just north of Detroit. We're about 1.3 million people. And I'm the elected prosecutor or district attorney, it's sometimes called. So we deal with charging people with crimes and prosecuting them. But just going way back, I actually started my career as a public school teacher in middle school and high school for 3 years. So kind of saw firsthand what that environment is. And then went to law school, became an attorney, and eventually I was also a circuit court judge, and I was in the family division. So that was I was just elected in January. So prior to that 6.5 years, I was in the family court, and in the family court, I presided over abuse and neglect cases and juvenile delinquent cases. So the issue of bullying sort of encompasses so many things, but I saw it sort of from all sides. And then lastly, I'm a mom. My husband and I have 5 children together, and I have been a mom of a kid who I felt was being bullied, and I've been a mom of a kid who posted something they shouldn't have in middle school. So I've sort of seen that on all sides. Also, my role as a judge and my role as prosecutor, I've really taken a big interest in educating myself on teen suicide and serve on a task force here in Oakland County. So I guess with regard to my topic, the question, and it's not so clear cut, is at what point does bullying trigger a criminal justice response? Now that is going to vary from state to state or from county to county, depending on how your law enforcement agency wants to deal with it or treat it, and then ultimately whether or not your prosecutor's office or district attorney's office would get involved criminally. Here in this office, we have a juvenile division, and they handle our abuse and neglect cases. So we actually prosecute petitions and where we remove children, or we file petitions on parents where we think there's abuse and neglect going on. And then we also prosecute juvenile delinquent matters where we charge juveniles with crimes. And those are not necessarily called convictions, they're adjudications, because we treat people differently. We treat children differently. So the answer to the burning question about whether or not bullying ventures into a crime or can be dealt with in the criminal justice system is it can be sometimes. So in Michigan, we have ways of addressing this behavior if it gets to that point. I do want to say that is not the ideal. The ideal, of course, the ideal is that it wouldn't take place, but the ideal is to identify those behaviors, and if they become so problematic that our office or law enforcement has to get involved, that we have programs. Here in Oakland County, we have a youth assistance program, and that is designed to address behaviors that could be charged as a crime for kids, usually somebody who's not been involved in the criminal justice system. And we divert that pre-charge, meaning they're never charged with a crime, but we assign somebody with a mental health background, social services, to sort of identify what is the issue. And that child makes an agreement and their parent with the youth assistance program, and they monitor them for a period of time. We see great results with that. And I would say the bulk of this kind of behavior should be dealt with in that kind of diversion. But sometimes It isn't, and it is harsh and serious enough that we will step in and prosecute. We have several ways of doing that, although it's not easy. We actually have a statute in Michigan that we haven't really even utilized yet, of an unlawful posting of a message. So, you know, I don't need to tell all of you, so much of this just occurs on social media or starts at social media, and ends with some sort of physical violence, which goes beyond what we're talking about. Anytime there is a serious threat of physical violence and accompanying with it the viable ability to actually follow through with that threat, that really is a criminal justice, may trigger a criminal justice response. And my suggestion and recommendation is, if that takes place, then some sort of law enforcement agency should step in. Now, that doesn't mean somebody necessarily has to be charged with a crime, but that a serious threat of violence needs to be taken seriously. Anytime there's, of course, any kind of physical touching, that's an assault and battery. Even the fighting that you see, I remember as a school teacher, being a public school teacher, and a fight would take place, and you know, we treat those things differently now. And I'm not suggesting we should charge kids with assault and battery. I'm suggesting they need to be educated by your law enforcement partner, whether that be a police agency or a prosecutor's office, about what is a crime and what isn't. Because oftentimes I think kids don't understand that. And I've done a lot of presentations in schools explaining that, you know, what you might think is a funny thing to post or put on Snapchat is actually a crime. And if you did that and you were 17 or 18, you could be charged with a felony. So I find that just the education and partnering with some sort of law enforcement agency or entity is really important. I mean, we want kids to stop doing this because it's not a nice thing to do, but ultimately you have to inform that you could be charged with a crime. So I guess I just want to make sure that there is a distinction between bullying and what we would consider serious crimes. Anytime the bullying seems to be motivated based on somebody's race, ethnicity, how they identify, their religion, most states in the country have hate crime statutes, and people are taking that very seriously. We are taking it very seriously, and you can be charged with hate crime. Now, that as a juvenile, you know, you may not have an adult record, but in Michigan, you'll have a juvenile adjudication. Any kind of, again, threat that involves a serious likelihood that somebody could actually carry out that threat. We see this actually more in the area of kids saying, I'm going to go blow up the school, or I'm going to go shoot somebody at the school. Those are taken very seriously. But paired with it has to be the ability to carry that out. Also, the malicious use of a telecommunications device. Anytime you use a phone or a computer or some sort of tablet to start bullying in terms of harassing or threatening, we can actually charge somebody based on their use of that if they have a malicious intent. We also have a stalking charge, which is serious. This is a repetitive acts that not just once, but many times, where somebody is being stalked, which means they are they can't really get away from this, which means that they know where they live, they know where they go to school, and it's a constant thing. So bullying can very easily move into the area of the criminal justice system. And again, that really depends on how assertive you want to be in involving law enforcement. And I guess the thing I would really recommend for educators is to really get to know what environment you're living in with regard to your law enforcement partners. Some districts, some counties are very aggressive. And if you call the police, a police report will be, they'll make a police report. And if they submit it to the prosecutor's office, now you have one of your students charged with a felony. That absolutely could take place. But you also have counties like ours, where we understand two things. One, we understand that the human brain is not really fully developed until well into the mid-20s. So we look at that in terms of holding kids accountable and proportionally to what that act is and what that consequence could be for them in the future. And then the second thing is trying to identify these behaviors and who might be victims of bullying and who might be the perpetrator. And so going back to where that might start, which is always where I'm really interested in talking about how do we prevent this from happening. When you talk about the abuse and neglect area, we know that even one day in foster care, so if a child is removed from a home, even one day in foster care increases their likelihood by 7 times that they will be a victim of homelessness, have a serious mental health issue, possible incarceration, suicide. So what we try to do is look at those kids who then, by the way, have a increased likelihood of being a crossover, which is not only are they abuse and neglect ward, but then as a juvenile, they get charged with a crime. And then of course, we know they have a serious risk of ending up in the adult criminal justice system. So we see these kids obviously as victims of bullying, and they've got a multitude of other problems. But they also become the perpetrator. So what we're trying to do here is sort of look at things in a different way and address kids we know might be vulnerable as victims or perpetrators, and address that with what resources do they need. Now, it's not an easy thing, and the juvenile justice system has a long way to go. But we do know who is most vulnerable. Having said that, this is really not a crime, as everyone understands, or an act that these incidents don't just take place in kids who are vulnerable. We have so much technology now to for kids or teenagers to use, and who have impulse issues already. And we try to be reasonable when those are presented to us. And I'm sure you'll cover this at some point on this presentation, but the technology is, we're as adults and parents, it's very important to understand what's available. We are always behind. There was always a workaround. And again, I know a lot of you already know this, but most of the kids who have parents who are supervising their social media, their workaround is they create another account in a different name. So mom, dad, or whoever is responsible doesn't see that and doesn't know about it. I don't like to be one of those people who just list a bunch of problems without solutions, but I'm not sure what the solution is there, but I do think that monitoring social media in a way that is not, what we call getting too involved with your kid, and it depends on their age, is really, really important, because those are where we're seeing incidents that occur that could likely be criminal charges. So I know all states also, if you feel that bullying behavior is a result of behavior that's being learned in the home because of what's going on, I know everyone on this forum understands the obligation and the duty to report that to some sort of Department of Health and Human Services or Child Protective Services. And that's very important. And it's also where we can really identify what the problem is and maybe prevent that child from being charged or being a further victim. The thing also I want to point out is when we talk about bullying, it really can encompass criminal behavior. And anytime a image of a child or an adolescent teenager is transferred from one device to another or posted that has any sexually explicit, for instance, a girl with no clothes on, and even if that's disseminated to somebody else, that is a very serious crime. And I have seen, as a family court judge, many kids who end up with felonies on their record. And that is and must be dealt with law enforcement, because that is a transferring child sexually explicit images. All states and actually the federal government have laws that prevent that. And this is actually comes from a place of child pornography. We're not really addressing it the way we should, but the statutes available to prosecute that are very serious. So I would say if that occurs, law enforcement must be called in. That's not just an issue of bullying. I'm happy to take questions. I guess the main message I want to leave you with is partner with your law enforcement entities to create, my guess is you already have them, but really good diversion programs so kids understand that it's serious enough to involve authorities, but it's also a way to deal with that issue and perhaps prevent it from happening again without a child having a criminal record or a juvenile adjudication.
I 100% agree. I think one of the best things the schools can do is have a very good relationship with their local police department, and that have an understanding of even what that school's policies are with your local police department. I think, we used to have a lot of programs in Michigan of school liaison officers. I mean, communities that are lucky to have those officers are really seen as just an extension of the school, and they're not seen as, oh, he's coming to get me. They really can become confidence in your school. And so thank you for mentioning that. And I mean,
we do see a lot of times schools are, teachers and administration are contacting law enforcement. And remember, in our county, and it's like this, if you're lucky enough to just have one law enforcement entity associated with your school district, then that you're fortunate. Here, we sometimes have very large school districts that might include more than one law enforcement entity. Right. But the police departments investigate crime. The prosecutor is the one to decide, though, whether or not they're going to charge that individual. And so, to a certain extent, which is why it's very good to not just have relationships with law enforcement, but also your prosecutor's office, depending on the demeanor or policies of that office, you might end up with a prosecution of a child that as a educator you didn't want, and I see that happening as well. Once it's out of your hands, it's really out of your hands, depending on what the prosecutor's office how they feel about it, and also candidly how vocal child's parents are usually about what they want happening. So I would just really encourage partnership so that you can all be on the same page about what should trigger and what will trigger a criminal justice response, and really educating kids. Unfortunately, there's a group of kids, and probably a large group, that care a lot about what their future holds and how that might affect college. Yeah. And I find that with a lot of the schools that I've been in, that's actually the most powerful thing, unfortunately. Look, you could end up with a criminal charge, and your opportunities are severely limited because of that.
Yeah, I think ever since I've been doing this and got involved in 2003, I think the cyber issues have just been the backbone of a lot of the problems, and that really need judicial oversight And we talked about that and trying to pass the policy that nobody wanted anything to do with cyber issues and cyberbullying. And we know that now that is one of the key things of what our students are facing and at times retaliating against, which
Mhm.
then also brings in the
You know,
legal.
I mean, I don't have the data. I'm sure somebody on this forum does, but I would just, from what we see, you know, the bulk of all of that is through the social media or online. It's rare that you have a kid that's, because that's the easy thing, right? If you have a verbal face-to-face threat, or because you
Yeah.
can see it, but we can't see it anymore, and it happens, you know, online or through Snapchat, and of course those images go away immediately. So it's tricky. We have to stay on top of it. You know, I have people in my office, kind of, actually a lot of them, and they'll say, well, it's, you know, I don't understand that. That's technology. It's not my thing. And, you know, look, I'm 51 years old, and I'm not like an expert on in cyber stalking or computer or technology, but it's my job to keep up with it. I mean, we can't as adults just say, you know what, I don't understand that. Because otherwise, you know, we can't keep kids safe if we do that. So it's our obligation to keep up with technology to the extent that we can. And I think that's also a really important part when we talk about identifying and preventing bullying. Make sure you understand and have your finger on the pulse of what's available to kids on social media. Those platforms change. We now have TikTok. I understand it's overwhelming. It is, but it's our job to figure it out, you know, and bringing somebody in to keep you apprised of what those current platforms are for kids, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's a constant education. It just keeps changing. So Deborah from Garden City asked, have you seen a significant increase in juvenile cases possibly related to bullying during this pandemic, and or you know, or other juvenile activities because of the pandemic?
What I do know is we saw a huge decrease in abuse and neglect cases because kids weren't out and about with in the community. So we didn't have kids going to school or after school programs or childcare or any of that, where we had teachers and mandated reporters, or even just neighbors or the public observing potential abuse and neglect. And we know that the events didn't decrease, but the charges did decrease, because we didn't have the ability to even know about it, which is really terrifying. And then we have in Michigan what we deem is these ghost children who never showed up to register for school, and we're not sure where they are. So so I would say what we've seen is a rise in concern that we aren't capturing and are not able to protect kids the way that we should, but not necessarily a rise in charges. And I'll also say too, you know, when I was elected, my platform and policy is really, we need to treat kids like kids. So, you know, prior to me being elected, you frequently saw 11-year-old, 12-year-olds charged with crimes. And my philosophy here is, you know, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old, that is not a, I'm not sure what we're doing by charging a child with a crime. What we really need is to address the what's going on in that kid's home, or with that child's usually an undiagnosed mental health concern, and address that, so that we don't always immediately just charge a child or anyone with a crime. We kind of look at it from a holistic point of view.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about the home life of, you know, some of the children, and I think if the parents are vocal, about on the prosecution end, probably for the prosecution, not so much against. But have you? This is from Chelsea in Washington, the state. So she got up early to be with us. So that's great. Have you seen cases where bullying where you feel the parents have actually contributed negatively to a situation?
Yes. And by that I mean they look, it's the same issue that every educator listening to this has. And actually, candidly, it's one of the reasons I left being a public school teacher. I loved teaching and I loved the interactions with children. It's the parents that drove me absolutely crazy. And this this move towards, I'm now going to defend and advocate for my child rather than hold them accountable. And I understand that it's a fine line, but we have parents, just like all of these educators experience, who come at this with issues with their kids as a way of defending rather than holding accountable. So I think two things. One, that whole movement as parents, which look, I wrestle with that too. We have to hold our kids accountable. We can be loving and caring and supportive, but we have to hold them accountable, and we have to also educate them about consequences. And then the second thing is just neglect. Parents who allow their child to have access to social media aren't educated or informed enough to understand how to limit content on the internet. So many times we have parents, kids are accessing really, really dangerous and serious, concerning content on the internet, and there's absolutely no supervision. So that, I think those two things are the things that we see most often.
With a lot of things going on, politically, and just, I think we see a lot more adults that are frustrated because of the pandemic. Have you seen, Becca from Sault Ste. Marie is asking, have you seen an increase, in bullying in schools because of there's so much bullying of teachers right now, administration and school boards? Do you see that being reflected, and is law enforcement being called in? Because it seems like parent behaviors are rubbing off on students.
So I think it's too early to, we haven't really tracked that data, particularly as you point out what we're seeing, behavior, parents about masks mandates. It is shocking. It's very difficult to hold children or teenagers accountable for behavior when it's being modeled, not just in their home, but in the community and in the public. We've had and are in the process of talking to school districts who are really concerned about threats and harassment as school board members that they're encountering just by doing their job. Again, I'm not certain that a criminal justice response is necessary, but I am certain that collaboration with your criminal justice community, law enforcement, and the prosecutor's office. And keep in mind, for those of you, a lot of lawyers don't even know this. You can have a great relationship with your police department, but if your prosecutor is not even going to consider diversion or charging or dealing with it, there's very little your police department can do. So it's really essential not just to know your local chief of police, but also to work with your prosecutor's office to ask questions like, as a school district, what kind of behaviors should we be educating our kids about might result in a criminal charge? Because if you have an office that doesn't take that seriously, then you're going to have to deal with it a different way.
And that'd be a really good way for a superintendent or a school board to work with their prosecutor to kind of build what they find out into their school policy. That would be another education model for the teachers to understand if it goes here to here. As you said before, there are certain things that mandated reporters, it is automatically reported, to police, especially in cases of, things being transmitted electronically. So it
is essential on so many fronts that, we have really good relationships with the superintendents in our county, because we'll have so many issues that spill over to school. For instance, if there is bullying gets to the level of a real criminal charge, you now have limits that judges and prosecutors ask for, no contact. Well, they go to the same school, they pass each other in the hallway, they're sitting in the same class. And so we really work with our school districts to be very informed and not make or ask for mandates that might be impossible to implement.
Last question. I think this is kind of important. Someone asked more about the ghost children that you mentioned that we're not tracking, we're not seeing. Is that something that, are we ever going to find out who that area is and who the ghost children kind of were, or is that just a label we're using?
Well,
unfortunately,
this is something we dealt with last year when we saw in the fall such a drop in kids coming back to public schools and what happened to them. Look, I have a real concern about kids, and I would really encourage the school district to not just let that go. Who are the kids that didn't come back and make contact? Where's your child? Did you move school districts? Are you homeschooling? Because if the, and look, I understand it's a lot to ask, but teachers are so important. They are usually the ones that are alerting us to abuse and neglect. And oftentimes they're the only way that we could find that. The homeschooling thing we see, I personally think is really concerning. We have a lot of people who say they're homeschooling their kid, and then we never really have an opportunity to track or make sure that child's being protected. So making the effort to see who didn't come back and follow up as to why is essential.
Yeah, it is. We have another follow-up question and we're also running out of time, but it's important that we kind of track that, right? And find out which kids were pulled out of school and, who needs help still in homeschooling. And
just if you think about it, who else will?
Right.
CPS isn't going to get involved unless there's an abuse and neglect suspicion. That is triggered usually by educators. The kids we're worried about probably are not going to the doctor. They're not involved in any other activity where you'd have access to a child. Now, look, we see the worst of the worst, and as a prosecutor and a former judge, I always say to my kids, I'm sorry, I can't unknow the things I know. But I'm very concerned about those kids, and the only way to track them is through the school districts. That's it. The CPS is not going to just start randomly making sure everybody's enrolled in school. And again, the trigger here and the worry is if that child just never came back to school after quarantine, where did they go? These are probably not kids who have identified solid homeschool programs. They're kids who likely are vulnerable.
Karen McDonald, Oakland County Prosecutor, former judge, former teacher, most importantly, mom. Thank you for the time you've spent with us and given people some very good information. Make inroads with your local law enforcement, your local prosecutors.
Find out what they consider a crime and what they'll charge and what they won't. It's really important to know that so that you can develop a protocol that makes sense and is reasonable and will keep kids safe.
And that's what we're all here. We're all here about keeping kids safe. So we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.